Surrealism wasn't just weird art and weird movies, as a person could imagine. It was a revolutionary way to hack reality, politics, and most surely the subconscious. It wasn't just a film genre, it was, and still is, a rejection of logic, of order, of rules, and of everything we were told made sense. Surrealist cinema wasn't made just to be seen and to be perceived and to entertain you. It was made to disturb you in some sense and get you thinking about the piece that you just watched. It wanted to grab you and pull you into a dream, eerie, nightmarish place or somewhere in between. This is the first chapter of a video series that I'm creating on the history of surrealist cinema, where it came from, how it evolved, and why it's still relevant, and why it still lingers in film today. Thank God it does. Think of it as a dreamy deep dive, in parts. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Born out of war, trauma, and deep distrust of reality, surrealism crashed into film like a fever dream. And for a while it flourished, disrupting the narrative, breaking every rule, blooming wildly, exposing the absurdity of life. And then it vanished. I don't know, it did. And this is a story of how surrealist cinema rose, rewired our understanding of film, and quietly collapsed. But this part is more specifically about how it flourished. It leaves behind itself a deep, unforgettable legacy of chaos, beauty, and total utter dissociation. So, the birth of surrealist cinema. In the 1920s, the world was broken. Europe has just survived the First World War, but at what cost? Millions dead, cities shattered, lives shattered, overpowering grief, and reality itself felt deeply unstable. Artists didn't want to make sense of the world anymore, because it didn't make sense, you know? They wanted to destroy the illusion of sense entirely. They wanted to alter and change the whole illusion of sense. Out of this came Dadaism, which in short was an avant-garde movement that appeared in art and illustrations and literature during World War I, prominently as a reaction to the terror and the perception of the war. Also, many Dadaists held very, very strong political views, which also then mirrored into their art. They also experienced with various art techniques, those which highlighted the importance of the unconscious mind. And soon after Dadaism, surrealism came into the scene, like a darker psychological younger sibling. But before surrealism came together entirely, its immediate predecessor, Dada, has already revolted against sanity. In Zurich, beginning of 1916, Duchamp and Arp forbid all logic and put their creativeness into anti-art performances. Surrealism inherited Dada's taste for unexpected absurdity and political critique, but it went beyond mere provocation. Instead of just attacking reason, they wanted to create a completely new reality through the unconscious mind, which kind of toes the line between art and between psychology, you know? But we'll get into that later. In surrealist art, therefore, even in the most bizarre images, they would have a purpose: to allow the mind to express itself freely. Now, since surrealism is deeply connected to the mind, as I already said, we'll talk mind and methods of surrealism. André Breton, a former medical student and psychiatrist, which is very cool, became the leader and chief theorist of surrealism. He actually treated World War I soldiers who suffered from the shell shock, which, fun fact, was a term used for mainly soldiers, right? Male soldiers. But many of the symptoms, such as blindness, paralysis, anxiety, depression, had a very similar overlap with hysteria, which was formerly a female psychological condition. It was initially considered to be male hysteria. Shell shock was considered to be male hysteria, which turns out it wasn't the same. It is basically something like PTSD, but not exactly. It is, but that was the former word for it. But the term shell shock itself was specifically created to avoid identifying male soldiers with the recognized weakness and emotionality of women. But that's just a little fact, not really connected, but pretty interesting to me. Anyway, Breton applied Freudian methods to the wounded mind of soldiers, and this experience showed him that the concealed workings of the brain contained strong emotional power. Surrealists eagerly drew on Freud's ideas. For example, they saw the interpretation of dreams, which is a book by Freud, and free association as the blueprint for art. Breton's 1924 Manifesto of Surrealism defined the movement as pure psychic automatism. Okay? Meaning the art of creating art without conscious control. In practice, surrealists sought to bypass reason and rules, so they let their unconscious mind to create the art and delve into creative work without any leashes and any things that would stop the mind from creating freely. But Freud's influence went even further. Surrealists believed that dreams were a gateway to the soul. They were like big door to the soul, And by intentionally provoking dreamlike states, they sought to achieve unexpected creations. In sum, surrealism turned the creative process on its head completely. Instead of carefully planning a painting, a story, whatever, artists would discover the art hidden in their subconscious. And I personally think that that's very interesting, and that's the most real and raw way to do it, to do art, usually, in my opinion. Now, since we've gone through the history, we can then move on to cinema and the surrealists. The emerging technology of film was irresistible to surrealists. Of course, it's film. By the 1920s, cinema had become widely accessible, thank God. Surrealists adopted film as another path to unleash irrational visions. In fact, the genre's pioneers included a mix of surrealists. I cannot speak French, okay, and there's a lot of French words upcoming, so just beware that I am not a French-speaking person, okay? That being said, René Clair's Entr'acte in 1924 was an early Dadaist collage of scenes that made absolutely no sense. Zero. And Germain Dulag's The Seashell and the Clergyman in 1928 foreshadowed surrealist cinema. And in 1930, Cocteau released The Blood of a Poet, which was a dreamlike film that is often mentioned alongside major surrealist works. But the movement's first self-conscious surrealist film came from Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dalí. In 1929, the Spanish director Buñuel and the Spanish painter Dalí in Paris co-wrote and co-directed the short on Chien, Andalou. And by the way, a silent film. It was by design a relentless dream sequence rather than a story. Because who likes a linear story? Okay, some people do. I like a linear story too, but if you watch only linear movies, then I don't think that surrealist cinema is exactly for you, but you should try it because it's really something. Okay, and you should watch this film, it's really good. Moving on, the film famously begins with a man sharpening a razor and rapidly cutting open a woman's eye. The film then proceeds through a series of bizarre scenes with basically no plot again. A bicycle riding man dressed as a nun. Later, a man's hand sprouted with ants or something like that. Grand pianos drag dead donkeys past a tied-up young woman. What? Yes, it's weird, it's weird, but somehow so fascinating, you know? Nothing obeys a classic narrative, as most movies do, instead leading on pure associative montage. The director of the film said that it was a violent reaction against what at the time was called avant-garde cinema. He and Dalí literally created the film from their own dreams, which is just iconic. That's just amazing. They just agreed that that's the film. Our dreams are the film. And then just shot these eerie, nightmarish visions. Perfect. And by the way, if the description reminds you of something, a scene from it was actually featured in the film Babylon in 2022. At the end, where they showed a sequence of different pieces of cinema, there was The Wizard of Oz, there was this on Chien, Andalou. That was the scene where the man was cutting the woman's eye. Just letting you know if that reminded you of something. Let's move on again. Buñuel and Dalí created a follow-up film titled L'Âge d'Or in 1930. Again, sorry for my French. A 63-minute film. Believe it or not, even more audacious. It was a sound film this time, and it was structured as an episodic fantasy. In theory, it was a love story, which is hard to believe, but it was a satire of the insanities of modern life and the sexual hypocrisies and religious principles. In short, L'Âge d'Or pulled no punches in mocking some set-up values. And reasonably, once it aired in Paris, it created chaos, physical attack, destruction of Dalí's paintings and other surrealist art. And the film got banned eventually. Understandable, okay? But in fact, it was not shown publicly again until the 1970s, which is kind of a long time. Despite this negative eruption at its start, at its release, history has been kind to it. Today it is regarded as a key work of surrealist cinema. They harnessed the movement's ideas, automatism, Freud's dream theory, and a revolutionary yearning, okay, to create images unlike anything anyone has ever seen before, and unlike anything cinema has ever seen before. On Chien, Andalou and L'Âge d'Or shocked audiences to the core and offended conservatives. But they also set in stone surrealists' impact on film history. You cannot imagine a cinema history without some surrealist art. You just can't. So, this was chapter 1. And in chapter 2, we will follow what happened next, how surrealism spread out into public cinema from Paris, how it influenced other filmmakers, and eventually seeped into popular culture. For now, we leave our eyes unblinking on these beginnings. Excited to watch where the movement goes from here. As always, thank you for tuning in, and give this a like or a comment if you like this. And follow me on my Spotify podcast if you wish. It's called Whatever Happens, and part 2 is coming soon, I hope. So if you want to keep diving into this weirdness of cinema, but good weirdness, okay? I love surrealist cinema. Then subscribe and keep an eye out. Okay, see ya!